What makes finance so confusing to outsiders is that most prominent financial experts don't do what they say they do. So if you talk to market makers or traders, they'll say they provide liquidity and manage risk in this very complicated way. And your average neighbor will just shrug their shoulders and say, wow, that's a good job. You must be really smart. In practice, they have monopoly access to flow, and the retail they trade against has access to stale prices, and it's very easy for them to make money for these two reasons: monopoly access, and they have better data. And most market makers on the New York Stock Exchange floor in the 90s would lose money, say, 2 days out of a year. So a monkey could make money with that position. Long-term capital management in the 90s, they were presented as trading wizards, and they used all these esoteric models and their 160 IQs and Nobel Prizes to make all this money. When they blew up, they looked at their book and they found that they had the following trades. They lost a lot of money because they were short US vol against the European vol. They were long US swap spreads, and they were long Russia. They also had these big pairs trade on, but that didn't hurt them so much. But these basic trades here, these relative value trades, are pretty straightforward trades anyone can understand, and most people would not do them because they're dumb. So to the extent they were making money, they were involved in simple trades that anyone would do, and they weren't smart trades. But while they were making money, it appears as though they were using some sort of magic. I read Jim Cramer's book about Confessions of a Street Addict, and he mentioned there his track record, and we had like a Sharpe of 3 or something, and he talked about all these deft trades based on fundamentals. But his trading frequency was inconsistent with that. It was much too short. You don't trade fundamentals every day. And further, the returns on his funds subsequent to being in a hedge fund is much closer to the market. I think it's less than the market, and that's a big come down from having a 3 Sharpe. So it's doubtful that he described his true trading strategy. I worked on asset liability committees, and supposedly these add value by managing yield curve exposures and taking advantage of mispricings in the yield curve and various things. But in practice, all he did was smooth earnings. And smoothing earnings means if you're going to miss earnings target this quarter, you pull some nuts out of the ground. And if you have extra earnings, you put some nuts back into the ground. And there are all sorts of clever ways to do that when you have a large banking book with all sorts of assets and liabilities, some of which are mark to market, some of which aren't. Nonetheless, no one ever said this is the true purpose of an ALCO committee. I was a bank economist for a little while, and like a stock analyst, I was mainly there for PR, to generate trade ideas. Now, to the public, we presented ourselves as knowing where future prices were going, interest rates, stock prices, but that's clearly not true. Even as a bank economist, we knew we didn't know. I don't know if the stock analysts are all honest with themselves like that, but you read about Henry Blodgett and Jack Grudman, and they were widely followed, and they generated a lot of trade ideas, which is their real value. But their purported value, their advertised value, was to predict where stock prices are going, and they were horrible at that. KMV's got a default model, and it talks a lot about their model, and I don't want to pick on it. It's a fine model, but they emphasize the special sauce. They emphasize the Merton model with all their little adjustments. Secret sauce is basically, ketchup and mayonnaise, or maybe ketchup, mayonnaise, and Thousand Island. But no one wants to say that, so they all have to have their special sauce, and the essence comes from this knife-edged extra value from just adding a little nip of parsley. But I'm highly dubious of those claims, and whenever I've looked into the guts of these models, I've found them to be basically ketchup and mayonnaise. It's easy to say you have alpha because it presumes a risk adjustment that no one can agree upon. Risk is essential for defining alpha because, remember, alpha is the residual of taking the return and subtracting out that risk adjustment. But because risk is indefinable, you're left with a lot of degrees of freedom. In a similar way, a lot of people who say they manage risk are really saying they have alpha. And it makes it very hard to criticize what they do because no one knows exactly what risk is. Usually they're dealing with some sort of proprietary data or relationships. Nonetheless, they don't want to admit that they're getting value from brand names or customers. It's much better to say you have this inimitable excellence and thus alpha.